Welcome back, guys. This is episode 3 of the King of the Cats Making of series, and this week we are going to be talking about art. And I figured the best way for you guys to learn about how I made the art for my new book, King of the Cats, would be to show you. So we're going to watch from sketch to final how I made a piece of promotional material for the book. Without much further ado, let's get started. Okay, so first things first, get some reference together and start doing thumbnails. Thumbnails are basically messy little sketches that you do to figure out what your composition is going to be. And once I have my thumbnail in place, I take it into Photoshop and enlarge it to the size I want to work at. And in this case, I did a little bit of cleanup sketching on top of it. And then I print it out at a low opacity, which means it's super duper light on the paper and you could barely see it. And then I start doing the final drawing on top of that. For this piece, I wanted to do a parody portrait of Queen Elizabeth I. So I got together a portrait of her and a picture of a cat in a pose that I thought would work well with the portrait. So while I'm making the drawing, I am using a violet coal erase pencil. The difference between a regular graphite pencil and a coal erase pencil is that, well, number one, the coal erase pencils come in fun colors like violet, and number two, they're actually a little bit waxier than a graphite pencil. So if you're like me and you drag your hand all over the paper when you're drawing, you won't smudge your pencil lines and make a big mess of both sides of your hand and all over your paper. So what I am doing while I'm making this drawing is adding all the little details that weren't included in the rough sketch. Why do I print it out instead of just making the rough sketch in Photoshop beforehand? Well, I personally like to draw by hand better. I like the feeling of a pencil in my hand. I like the texture and the push and pull of it dragging on the paper. It's a little harder for me to get used to drawing entirely in Photoshop, so I do it this way. It adds a little bit of a step through the process, but I like doing it. As I'm going through and making this drawing, I'm trying to keep a good mixture between the reference and the kind of cartoonization that I'm going for. What I'm doing now is I'm transferring the final clean line drawing to the piece of watercolor paper. So how I do that is I have a special graphite spray called transfer spray, and I make a copy of my drawing and I spray the back of the copy and tape it down to the watercolor paper. Then I very carefully trace all the lines exactly how I want them, and what I'm left with is a graphite copy of my drawing on the watercolor paper. That is great because it A, saves your original drawing, so if you mess up you can just do it again, and B, it keeps you from having to erase on the watercolor paper, which can sometimes ruin the surface of the paper completely. So now we're here doing the watercolor, which is going to be the most fun part for you guys to watch, I think. The first thing I do is I go through and I add a base layer of all the colors that are going to be in the piece. And that's just basically a flat wash of every color. When I'm going through, I try to move to different areas that aren't touching each other, because when you're working with watercolor, you don't want to have two areas of wet paint that are a different color right next to each other, because they will flow into each other and you'll get kind of like a weird mixture, and you'll have yellow where you wanted your beige and red where you wanted your blue, and it'll turn purple. It's a mess. So to avoid that, you jump around the picture and do different areas. The paint I am working with right now is Winsor and Newton Cotman watercolors, and they're actually a student grade paint, but I have found them to be so high performing that it doesn't really matter. The difference between a student grade paint and an artist grade paint is the quality of pigments in them and the concentration of pigments in them, but I haven't really found, honestly, that much of a difference between the Cotman Winsor & Newton and the artist grade Winsor & Newton. Why can't I say that? But like unless with certain colors, that's what I was saying. And I got this palette when I was first starting out doing watercolor because I wanted to make sure I liked it, and student grade watercolor is much, much, much cheaper than artist grade watercolor. And I just liked the palette so much and the colors that were in it that I really never stopped using it, even though I did eventually invest in more expensive artist pigments. So I still pull out these guys every so often, and since I had originally done illustrations for The King of the Cats in this when I was using this palette when I was in school, I figured why not stick to the original paint palette that I had used. So now I have zoomed in so you guys can see me doing the line work a little bit more closely. I tend to crawl up on the edge of my brush, so my hand is blocking a lot of it. Sorry about that. But what I do to get these bright opaque lines with the watercolor, when watercolor is normally thought of as being much more suited to these light and airy washes like you saw me doing earlier, is I make a more concentrated mix of the color. And what that means is I add less water to the paint than I normally would. And that allows me to do these opaque lines with the watercolor paint. Watercolor is really all about water control. So as long as you have a pretty good handle on how much water you need to add to your paint to get the effect you want, you'll be in good shape. Okay, so now I'm going through and doing the fur. The fur is actually my favorite part to do because you get to do these little flicky bits, and it's really, really fun to play with the brush that way. The brushes that I am using to get these lovely fine lines are Raphael Kolinsky Sable brushes. Kolinsky sables are actually a special kind of sable from Russia, and the brushes are made specifically of the tail hairs of the male sable. And these brushes are coveted for their ability to hold water and snap to a really perfect fine point. You can use synthetic brushes when you're first starting out, and in fact, some artists use synthetic brushes throughout their entire career. Some prefer them to the natural hair brushes. But I find that the Kolinsky Sable brushes do hold a better point. They also hold more water, so you can go for longer without having to re-dip your brush. And the other thing is the hair is softer, which if you're like me and you like to paint in a lot of layers, is good because you're much less likely to disturb the paint underneath. Watercolor, even once it's dry, is still able to reactivate to a certain extent, and by reactivate I mean the pigment will possibly move if you add more water to an already dry area. So the softer your brush is, the less likely it is that you will move the pigment around because it has less impact on the paper. So what I'm doing now is adding some details to the collar. I fill those in to give a little depth and give that kind of like ruffled collar effect, simulate it a little bit. Now, as you can see, I'm going back and adding another layer to the cloak. Like I said before, I'm using those Kolinsky brushes, and as you can see, it is not disturbing the paint underneath, both because I gave the layer a long time to dry and because of the softness of the bristles. Oh, but this is fun. Like I said earlier, I tend to drag my hand across the paper. Don't be like me because I just disturbed my paint and had to go in and fix it. I've heard a lot of people say that watercolor really isn't forgiving, but I've found the opposite to be true. Usually, even if you smudge your paint into an area you don't want it to be in, you can kind of re-wet it and scrub it out as long as you're quick about it. And if you let an area dry, you can usually go back in and cover it with more paint if you mess up and stick your hand in it or smudge it some way like I just did. So now I'm adding details to the cloak. Oh, and this is a really fun part. I really liked doing this to simulate the kind of tapestry effect that was going on the original cloak. I designed this little swirly curly pattern, and I achieved the modeled texture of the swirls by getting a pretty watered down pigment mix and going over it so you could see the yellow through it in some spots, but letting the water settle on its own, specifically not trying to keep it perfectly even, so you would have different tones of brown and yellow throughout the pattern. And now I'm going through and tightening up and adding final lines, putting in all those last little details to make sure each and every gem and jewel is perfect. And here I'm going in with a white gel pen to add highlights. You can do that with white gouache and a brush too, but I found that a gel pen is much more convenient for little highlights like this. And I think we are about to close in on the video, so I will see you guys next week when we talk about my personal connection and how I got started on this project.